For much of the last decade or two, the world has seen many videos showing many senseless acts of violence perpetuated against black people, whether by police officers or by civilians. We can talk about racism as a personal belief in the inferiority of another arbitrarily defined group of people, or as a set of policies that are systematically enacted to keep one group in an inferior social, political, and/or economic position. In the United States, both personal and institutional racism developed alongside the settlements founded by Europeans. When wealthy settlers tried to use indentured servants to farm the New World, they had three options: other Europeans who they needed to convince to come to the New World, Native Americans who knew the land and whom other natives would help, or already enslaved Africans whom they could purchase. As we know, they chose to purchase more and more enslaved Africans, thus creating a greater demand and the resulting enslavement of millions of people. In time, the difference between slaver and enslaved were legally established based on a drop of African blood. Thus, the inferior slave status was identified with blackness, Africans, and their descendants. This idea of racial inferiority was further encouraged by European colonization of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia, and imperialism, by the debate over abolition of slavery, and by the Enlightenment's desire to make sense of the world. Phrenology also contributed. It is the study of little intellectual value that attempted to argue that mental and physical traits were the result of different sizes of the head. Finally, modern racism developed from nationalism and social Darwinism, another pseudoscience that misconstrued Darwin's theory of natural selection. Together, the ideas of nationalism and social Darwinism led to the ranking of some peoples as inferior or superior to others, more or less strong than others, or more or less civilized than others. This racist ideology has, at various times, been enshrined in cultural practices and laws, and these laws further perpetuate racist ideology and policies. So, why did I provide an overview of modern racism in order to discuss ancient ideas about race and racism? First, it is important to point out that many of these social phenomena did not exist or exist in the same way in antiquity. Even if they did exist, they were not codified or reinforced by laws. Ancient peoples were enslaved, but slavery did not become associated with any particular race or ethnic group. People were enslaved as a result of defeat in war, being kidnapped, or being born to an enslaved mother. There was no way to identify an ancient slave by looking at them. Slaves and free people also did some of the same work. This is not to say that ancient slaves were not mistreated. Many masters were terrible, and slaves were required to be tortured before they could provide evidence in court. So some slaves did rebel or resist their masters through working slowly or imperfectly. Even though the Emperor Hadrian did pass a law to encourage slightly better treatment of slaves, there was never a social movement to abolish slavery in either ancient Greece or Rome. In sum, the ancient Greek and Roman practice of enslaving war captives and their descendants prevented the mental connection between the inferior slave status and any particular group. Secondly, we can talk about the imperialism of ancient Greeks and Romans. The Spartans conquered and enslaved the Messenians. The Athenians established two brief empires around the Aegean Sea. The Macedonian Alexander the Great conquered Greece, Persia, and campaigned into India. The Romans conquered many peoples living around the Mediterranean basin. For the most part, unlike modern imperialism, ancient imperialism involved the conquest of enslavement of people who looked relatively similar to their conquerors. That is not to say that the Greeks and Romans did not know or conquer people of another color. Starting as early as the 5th century BCE, the Greeks described Ethiopians as a people we would call black, but as early as Homer, the Greeks knew of Ethiopians. These black people were mentioned in many other texts and were depicted on vases and in ancient sculptures. Black people lived among Greeks and Romans as equals. For example, we know of black actors, we know that black and white people married each other, and we know that black soldiers accompanied the Emperor Septimius Severus on his campaign to Britain during a civil war. The Emperor Septimius Severus and his successor and son, Caracalla, were also from northern Africa. The differences in geographic origin, visual appearance, and historical experiences led to the creation of stereotypes about black people, just as stereotypes developed around other peoples. Greeks thought people from Ethiopia were courageous and skilled soldiers, and their courage and strength continued to be respected by the Romans. They were also respected for their special knowledge and influence in the worship of Isis, as shown in this fresco, whose worship spread from Egypt throughout the Mediterranean world. Furthermore, even though some Greeks and Romans preferred the beauty of people who looked more like them, many were attracted to and appreciated the beauty of black bodies. Interestingly, the contrast between black and white skin was combined with the associations of the color black with death and the underworld in order to create the idea that black bodies were ominous. For example, as an omen presaging the assassination of the Emperor Caligula, at night there were Egyptian and Ethiopian actors rehearsing a theatrical scene involving the underworld. As mentioned before, black people from Ethiopia were not the only targets of ancient stereotypes. Here, Varro suggests that people from certain regions are more or less suited to be enslaved for herding sheep or raising cattle. Other authors associate Greeks with medicine or education. Jewish people were known to avoid eating pork, but later anti-Semitic stereotypes claiming that Jewish people were greedy had not developed. Indeed, based on archaeological evidence, we know that people in Judea avoided many luxuries. These stereotypes often led to xenophobia, or fear and hatred of foreigners. The common term for foreigners was barbaroi, or barbary. The Greeks referred to anyone who did not speak Greek or lived by the same customs as barbaroi, and the Romans classified people who were not Greek or Roman as barbari. Among the Greeks, this xenophobia peaked in the 4th century BCE, when Isocrates was calling for the unification of Greeks and assaults on the luxurious Persians who had failed to conquer Greece at the beginning of the 5th century. Among the Romans, there was tension among an appreciation of foreign cultures, a disdain for foreign cultures, and a desire to preserve Roman culture. For example, Greek intellectuals, philosophers, and teachers were hired and their books were purchased, but they were also ordered to leave the city a few times during the late Republic. Foreign gods were also worshipped in Rome, but usually only if their temples were outside the Pomerium, the religious and ritual boundary for the city of Rome. In order to justify and explain some of these and other stereotypes, Greek and Roman intellectuals espoused an environmental theory. It held that extremes of the world were too hot or too cold, and these extremes made different peoples intelligent or warlike, but not both. The heat also made Ethiopians black, and the cold made Scythians lighter-skinned with blonder or redder hair. The ideal was in the middle, where people had both intelligence and courage. As you might expect, Greek intellectuals thought the ideal was in Greece, and Roman intellectuals thought it was in Rome. They also thought that traits from these places of origin were inherited by their descendants, even if they no longer lived in Ethiopia, Scythia, Greece, or Rome. In a way, this environmental theory was a type of racist ideology. It ignored individual characteristics, fixated on stereotypes, and claimed these stereotypes were caused by nature and unable to be changed by people themselves. Indeed, it shows a great lack of familiarity with the people being stereotyped and their lived experiences. In a way, this racist environmental theory was used to justify or argue for imperial expansion, at least by Socrates when he wanted Persia to be attacked. However, there was another belief that opposed this argument. The Greeks and Romans believed that luxury made people soft and weak. Therefore, the Persians were soft, weak, and supposedly could be conquered by the Greeks. Luxury, though, also affected the conquerors. The Romans believed that the plunder, slaves, wealth, and luxury from successful military expansion caused cultural decay and weakness. The turning point that started this decay or accelerated it was often placed in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. By contrast, the German tribes lived a free life and were free of luxury, and so were still supposedly strong and militarily mighty. So, I've given you a lot of information here, and there's a lot to process. Indeed, I required a lot of reading and thought to assemble and think about all of these ideas. But history is said to be able to teach us lessons or provide new ways of looking at situations. So, how can ancient perspectives on race and racism help us think about modern racism and races? First, things do not have to be the way they are. We grow up in a society and are taught to think things should be the way they are because that's how they have always been. But they haven't actually always been this way, as I've shown here. Nor am I saying that the Greeks and Romans were perfect. They enslaved and mistreated people too. Third, there are common habits or practices that humans have. Humans tend to stereotype and have views about the other as a way of making sense of the world. And some would argue we're neurologically programmed to do so. However, these stereotypes, like many of the ancient ones, are born from ignorance and partial impressions. That brings me to point 4. Learning about other peoples reduces ignorance and inaccurate stereotyping. We should talk to, read about, and learn about other peoples and their lived experiences, just as this video has given you a better appreciation for the reality of the ancient Mediterranean world. Finally, we can ask ourselves, what beliefs underlie our current system, and is there a tension between them? I mentioned that the racial ideology of the environmental theory privileged Greece and Rome, but it was in conflict with the idea that luxury caused weakness. I would argue that the United States of America is afflicted by a fundamental disagreement between two of its core cultural beliefs and underlying ideas, that is, white supremacy and equality for everyone. And that's a pretty heavy note to end on, and I imagine that it causes discomfort for some of us. I encourage you to embrace and interrogate that discomfort. Why might these ideas make you uncomfortable? Which of your values do you want to prioritize as a guiding principle in your life? With that internal discomfort addressed and your prioritized values in mind, channel the discomfort outward. Think about how you want to use that guiding principle and create a better world for everyone.